My name is Bruce. Being able to travel for several months was always part of my job, while my wife Cher stayed home. I trusted her completely and never allowed the thought that I might lose her. My faith in her love was boundless. One day, however, while returning home after a long absence, I was confronted with a reality that will forever be etched in my memory. The day I learned of the betrayal was one of the hardest. No signs portended trouble, the day was perfectly ordinary, and even the weather didn't stand out as anything special. I returned home that evening, full of hope that I would see Sherry, who had been with me for 6 years. But she wasn't home. Sherry was working part-time at an insurance company that had recently hired a new employee named Lawrence. Her absence didn't initially cause me any alarm, but as time went on, I began to worry. My anxiety peaked when the doorbell rang. I expected to see Sherry. However, there were 2 policemen standing on the doorstep. One of them calmly asked me, "Mr. Arroyo," confirming my premonition of impending trouble. The police brought news, the worst possible news. They reported that Sherry was no longer with us. Her body had been found in the river. The police officer's words sounded unreal, and I couldn't repeat them exactly. My pain was indescribable. In those first days after the tragedy, I shed many tears, turning to a God I had not previously believed existed. As I pondered the reasons for such cruelty of fate, I was lost in memories, going through Sherry's personal belongings. I couldn't bear the thought of never seeing those things on her again. People tried to comfort me, but their words seemed empty. The hardest part was calling Sherry's parents who live overseas. It seemed like it couldn't get any worse, but the situation kept getting worse. No one could figure out how Cher ended up in the river that day or why she was even in that part of town. The autopsy results showed that she had taken a large amount of what were probably sleeping pills before she died. When they started talking about a possible suicide, I couldn't believe it. The police met me on the doorstep. They warned me that I would have to come to the station when I was ready. As they talked, I refused to believe that Sherry could have committed such an act, let alone make any sense out of it. In the back of my mind, I was still hoping to see her walk through the door with that same charming smiling face that I had fallen in love with from the beginning. After the police left, I finally mustered up the strength to open my laptop and check my email. It was then that I found an email next to the laptop that turned my life around even more. It was written to Sherry. You could see the ink was blurred with her tears. In the letter, she called me my dear beloved husband. She wrote that by the time I read this, she'd be long gone, apologizing for breaking my heart and confessing that she couldn't live like this anymore. Sherry couldn't forgive herself for what she had done to our marriage. She mentioned the night Lawrence held her up after work under the pretense of helping her with her paperwork. His intentions turned out to be different. She tried to resist, but eventually her strength waned and she eventually gave in. After taking advantage of her, he showed her the videotape, threatening to distribute it if she did not submit to his will again. When she got home, she cried until morning. She wanted to tell me everything at once, but I was on a business trip. By the time I returned, Lawrence had threatened to expose her to me, to our friends, to her parents, to the whole world. She felt alone and saw no way out, so she gave in to his demands. She asked me to forgive me, saying she couldn't take it anymore and had to end it all. She knew she would not be able to meet me on my return and could not accept the situation. She prayed that I could forgive her for my choices. She hoped that I would find the strength to forgive her and meet someone worthy to take her wife's place. As I read this letter, I couldn't gather my thoughts when faced with such loss and betrayal. I never intended to go to the police, never even considered it. I realize now that if I had acted differently, my story might have turned out differently. Sitting alone, I remembered our first meeting. Instead of university, I had chosen a life at sea, joining the Merchant Navy. Soon I found myself on a supertanker lost in the middle of the ocean. The company didn't see fit to train new recruits, believing the best way was to throw us into deep water and see if we drowned or learned to swim. My early years at sea were marked by seasickness, homesickness, and brief stops at ports around the world. Despite these short visits, our status and paychecks made us popular with the local women. That all changed when the company moved me ashore to the technical office. I was happy with my new career direction, although I was promised the opportunity to return to the ship if I wanted to. During my 3rd week ashore, I met Sherry at a party. She was different from anyone I had met up to that point. Rarely had I spent a night with a girl without any repercussions lying in bed with her unless I was too drunk or at a fight. Sherry was different. She seemed to be the one who suggested we take our relationship to the next level. A month later, we decided to go for it, and a year later, our lives were closely intertwined in marital ties. But 6 years later, everything came to an abrupt end. I, wiping away tears, vowed that Lawrence would pay for taking Sherry away from me. There was no doubt in my heart that there was only one person on whom I could pour out my pain. I knew I should go to the police, but instead I found myself standing in front of the door of the insurance company, not knowing how I got there. Ignoring the receptionist's mocking looks, I headed straight for the office of Lawrence, the insurance agent who seemed to know more than he was telling me. "What have you done to my wife?" My voice, full of anger, rang out as I met his gaze. Lawrence jumped up, creating a barrier of tables between us, and began to apologize. But I interrupted him. "You blackmailed her, didn't you?" "That's absurd," he shouted back, insisting that I had no proof. But when I mentioned the letter which might prove his guilt, Lawrence turned pale. "Let's see what the police have to say," I exclaimed, holding the letter right in front of his face. Something inside me snapped as he tried to attack me. Despite his physical advantage, I was more prepared for battle due to experience gained in the harshest parts of the world. He probably hadn't fought since his high school days. Chasing him around the table soon revealed that his attempt to strike was so clumsy that I could have easily dodged. But I didn't. Instead, I retaliated with punches, knocking him to the ground and continuing to hit him further. Suddenly, I felt myself being dragged away by the police, attracted by the noise. They rushed in and dragged me out of the office where I had just beaten Lawrence. I walked toward the cell, feeling sore all over my body and overwhelmed with anger. I felt no regret whatsoever. I longed for justice for my wife. Despite the lack of murder, I realized the depth of my hatred for Lawrence. It was the moment I truly understood what it meant to feel disgust for someone. Although it was a difficult experience, it somehow helped me ease the pain of loss. I had always thought that humans had a limited amount of emotions, but now they were overwhelmed with sadness. After I had brutally beaten Lawrence, I felt the sadness replaced by anger. I realized that I might have to pay for my actions, but given the evidence I had of Lawrence's blackmail, I consoled myself with the thought that he would suffer even more in front of the court. This prospect comforted me somewhat until I realized that I had forgotten to make a copy of an important letter from Cher. The moment the police led me out of Lawrence's office, it was clear that without that letter things would not go in my favor. I had convinced myself that the truth would prevail and the evidence would be found. Seeing Lawrence's condition, however, I doubted whether he could escape the consequences. But his secretary, questioned by the police, denied having seen the letter. I desperately pleaded with law enforcement to look into the situation, appealing to them with tears in my eyes. But my efforts were in vain. In the end, it came down to his word against mine, and my mental state at that point was questioned. The detective seemed to believe me, but without evidence to prove my case, the case was at a dead end. Lawrence decided to press assault charges against me, and his attorney insisted that I be detained pending trial, claiming that I was a threat to his client. In the end, Lawrence was acquitted, although he had reason to be concerned, but not for my safety. My hatred for him reached a fever pitch, but given the circumstances, the trial could have ended worse for me. I couldn't hold back a smile as I watched Lawrence, limping, approach the witness table. The marks of my blows were still visible on his face. He avoided meeting my gaze, though I never looked away. I wondered if that had affected the jury's decision. The prosecution tried to portray me as dangerous because of my interest in boxing. However, my lawyer emphasized that boxing was just a high school hobby for me. I was amused that boxing was a concern for them, but what about soccer? After all, it was with my feet that I did the most damage to Lawrence when he tried to hide under the table. Just when my case seemed doomed, something happened that tipped the scales slightly in my favor. It happened during Lawrence's deposition. My attorney asked his opinion of my actions after the prosecution accused him of driving my wife to suicide. Such an accusation caused a commotion in the courtroom. The judge weighed his words, warned my defense attorney to be more careful in his wording, and ordered the jury to ignore the issue. Continuing with this theme, my defense counsel asked Lawrence a clarifying question about whether he really believed my actions were due to his pressure on my wife. As soon as he finished his question, a wave of outrage swept through the courtroom. It took the judge 10 minutes to restore order. He then severely reprimanded my lawyer and denied the prosecutor's request for a recess, which seemed to make things more difficult for the prosecution. When it was my turn to testify, the conversation again returned to my conflict with my late wife's employer. My attorney phrased the question in such a way that I was given the opportunity to give my version of events. Although I had to choose my words carefully, I talked about my wife's letter in which she explained the reasons for her actions. This caused a new flurry of activity on the part of the prosecutor, but the judge quickly put him on the spot. When asked about the current whereabouts of the letter, I replied that I had left it in that person's office before I proceeded with the actions for which I was being tried. The judge tried to contain the emotions in the courtroom, but when I began to talk about the reasons for my actions of raping my wife and blackmailing her, the room exploded again. The attorneys, jurors, and even some spectators stood up, causing chaos. At this point, my attorney requested a recess, and the judge seemed relieved to grant his request, ordering us and the prosecuting attorneys to come to his office immediately. At this point, I realized that I had a chance to change the course of events, if only I could keep quiet. In the end, my case in court was concluded quickly and without much complication. The judge informed the jury without apology that despite my explanation, my confession to the assault put me outside the law. Without hesitation, the jury found me guilty. To my surprise, the judge sentenced me to 3 months in prison, which wasn't too bad considering the time I had spent in custody before my trial. This event caused widespread press coverage. I had to take the warning that any careless remarks could land me back in court. Blower's reputation was tarnished and his business collapsed within 6 months. I was satisfied with the outcome, realizing that Lawrence was not worth the risk. The 3 months in prison had been a serious lesson for me. I realized I didn't want to go back there. I forgive Sherry, realizing there's no point in holding a grudge. She had been reckless in leaving me alone. A year later, I was glad to return to my previous job, although I felt somewhat uncomfortable there, especially at first. Lawrence, despite everything, had managed to open a new office. But I hadn't forgotten his past actions and figured he would learn his lesson one winter evening. Although I was waiting for him outside his office, he couldn't be sure of my identity. I had an alibi. I could have seriously harmed him, but I decided to limit it to a lesson. The police questioned me, but I had a solid alibi since I was spending time with friends on the ship. I began to wonder if I really liked the person I had become. Life came to a standstill, and I didn't know what was going to happen next. Realizing that it was time for a drastic change in my life, I decided that I needed to immerse myself in the expanse of the sea. This decision suddenly brought relief to my office colleagues who seemed tired of my constant unfulfilled promises. I realized that it was time to seek help from a psychologist and get rid of the obsession with revenge that was gradually destroying my life. Hating the man I disliked so much was hurting me more than his own actions. The sea seemed like an easy way to escape, but life, as usual, had other plans. Everything changed a few days before my trip to Kuwait, my 4th in a year. Walking down the street, I suddenly came face to face with Lawrence. "Where are you going?" he bellowed, standing only 3 steps away from me. "Lost?" I parried, stepping back as he moved toward me. "You'll pay, Arroyo," he threatened, and in that moment, all my good intentions vanished like smoke. He was standing right in front of me, unaware of my plans, and I was ready to take advantage of that. He made a clumsy lunge, which I easily dodged, looking around for witnesses to our confrontation. He tried to hit me again, and I reacted sharply, remembering my brief boxing training. His next punch caught me off guard, making me instinctively throw my head back in pain. I landed a left hook right in his face, feeling something slam under my fist. I then tried to land a right hook to his unprotected chin, but missed, hitting lower than I intended. Missing his chin, I hit him right in the throat. The sensation of crushing his larynx was indescribable. He fell to the ground, clutching his neck, making horrible coughing sounds. I was ready to strike again, this time at the sorest spot, but stopped at the last moment, realizing the consequences with so many witnesses around. It's not worth it, I thought, and walked away. An hour later, I found myself at the police station writing a statement, including the names and addresses of the 5 witnesses to his attack on me. At the trial his friends had attended, I was testifying against him. My dream was that he would get a life sentence, but in the end the court sentenced him to only 3 months probation. This sentence did not surprise me, but it somehow softened my indignation, although it did not completely destroy my hatred. The desire for revenge became less acute. I began to convince myself that, despite his actions leading to my wife's suicide, he had not planned for that outcome. My guilt for not being home the night she returned also began to gnaw at me. However, deciding that my hatred was eating me up from the inside out, I sought help from a psychologist. This man, not an expensive specialist, but with a wealth of life experience, advised me to get over my grief and hatred. I needed to forgive my abuser. If I didn't, I would remain miserable. Following his advice, I realized that forgiveness had to be personal, so I decided to face him face to face. It wasn't easy, but the advice proved to be sound. It took 3 days to find him, and by then he was already working in the office handling auto insurance claims after losing his license. I realized that this move helped me find peace and move on with my life. He clearly didn't want to meet me, but I'd managed to convince him otherwise. So we ended up face to face on neutral territory, choosing a secluded park bench. We sat down, avoiding direct eye contact, both wanting to end this unpleasant interaction as soon as possible. My counselor insisted I forgive you. The words stuck in my throat, but I was determined to say them and disappear. He was surprised to hear my words. I forgive you, I said, trying to sound convincing. I know what you did to my wife, but I forgive you. Because I need to move forward, I explained, even though I felt inside that it wouldn't solve all my problems. His reaction was overwhelming. He laughed at my words, claiming that he had only been with her once and that, as he put it, it was far from an enjoyable evening. I did my best to keep my composure, holding tightly to the armrests to keep from lunging at him. Arroyo, he laughed, she wasn't even good at it. Those words were the last straw, and I lost control. Though I had forgiven him at the beginning of the encounter, those words sent me into a storm of emotions and I gave in to my fists. I remember him begging for mercy when I hit him and his screams as I continued to beat him. The details of that moment faded as I recall, but I left him there on the bench and walked away without looking back. A few days later, I was on my way to my ship, which was on its way to Saudi Arabia. I was surprised to learn that I had done this without being arrested. I was never questioned or even contacted about Lawrence's murder. Yeah, you got that right. Brandon Bernard, the local troublemaker, had come under suspicion. It all became clear when it was discovered that Bernard, who worked for the same insurance company as the victim, could link him to the crime. When I heard the news of the body found in the park, I was shocked to realize that this time the press was wrong. The Bernard case had really resonated. He openly admitted to the shooting, claiming that the victim really deserved his fate. However, the case took an unexpected turn when a forensic expert stated that the victim could have been dead before Bernard shot him. This opinion was challenged by another reputable expert, sparking a debate about the credibility of such claims. Bernard, realizing that the charge of killing a dead man hardly seemed convincing, told a story about his search for the victim, whom he allegedly found lying motionless in the park. He added that he had seen a man of non-European appearance running away, describing him as a dark-skinned man about 5 feet 6 inches tall and with a limp. Considering that I am a few inches taller, have a different skin color, and have no mobility issues, his words made me wonder, was his story fabricated or was he trying to indirectly repay me by giving a false description? Now, I'll never know for sure, but I'm grateful that his story threw the investigation off track and caused the press to speculate about the mysterious stranger. Reports about the mystery man flooded in from around the country, sparking discussions about immigration policy. Eventually, the murder charge was downgraded to manslaughter and then to aggravated assault and unlawful possession of a weapon, resulting in a 9-month prison sentence with the possibility of parole for good behavior. But Bernard's story didn't end there, although that's another story not relevant to me. I couldn't be sure if I had killed the victim or not, but it was enough for me to know that I had fulfilled my promise to avenge Sherry without feeling that I was a murderer. My hatred suddenly dissipated, just as the psychologist had predicted. Over the years, I went on with my life, became an assistant captain, found a new love, and we had children who became everything to me. But every now and then my thoughts would return to Sherry, wondering what if her life hadn't been cut short so early. Although in the back of my mind I sought comfort in my new family, I still missed Sherry. So that's the end of the story. Do you think the main character's revenge is morally justified? Why was the wife, the protagonist's wife, afraid to tell their husband the truth? We believe that the protagonist sought to make amends. He wanted to forgive the man who had vilified his wife and to separate peacefully. However, the coworker began to bully the protagonist and his wife. What kind of reaction did he expect? The protagonist committed a terrible act, a crime, and for this he should be punished in prison. But it cannot be assumed that the deed was done without reason. Morally, the protagonist acted justifiably. He went for reconciliation, but he was provoked. However, from a legal point of view, he should be punished in prison because he decided to follow through. The protagonist's wife was intimidated. The protagonist was on business trips and she couldn't hold it all in. She probably wanted to tell everything when he came home, but it was too late. Conscience plus fear played their part and led to a sad end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like to not miss new, no less interesting stories. Good luck!
Thank you so much for watching my video and your time. Please subscribe to my channel and click on the bell button. Also, I am very interested to know your personal opinion about this story. You can write it in the comments. I will definitely read it and reply to you personally.